The Joint Subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself, Ranking Member Deutsch, Ranking Member Sherman for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize the Chair of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce, for such time as he may consume. I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. Unfortunately, due to weather, Mr. Poe has been delayed, but he hopes that he will be able to make it before our hearing ends. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. The Chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Last November, President Obama announced that the P5+1 and Iran had come to an interim agreement over Iran's nuclear program. The administration hails it as a big step forward, yet it refuses to allow the full details to be made public. I viewed the text, as have many others on our panel here today, and I don't see any reason for it to remain a state secret other than the administration doesn't want the American people to see how badly we got suckered. The Joint Plan of Action is a lopsided bad deal for the United States and for our allies, like the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, and Iran continues to take advantage of it every day. And that is the crux of the problem here. The administration is asking us to trust it, that it can ensure that the Iranian regime plays by the rules when 35 years proves otherwise. So today we're taking an in-depth look at exactly with whom we are dealing as the administration seeks to make deals with the Iranian regime. The hearing will focus on perhaps the most critical fact that has been downplayed and even ignored throughout this nuclear deal process, and that is the fact that Iran is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. Iran is only one of 4 countries designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism, SST. In order to be designated an SST, a country must have repeatedly provided support for acts of international terror, and that is a major part of Iran's foreign policy. Recently, we have seen Iran support terrorist acts in Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, and even right here in Washington, D.C., as an Iranian plot to assassinate the ambassador of Saudi Arabia was uncovered. Then there is Iran's involvement in Latin America. Iran's presence there has grown rapidly and now poses a very serious threat to our national security. Last year, I convened a hearing on the Iran-Syria nexus, and Ambassador John Bolton testified that the largest Iranian diplomacy facility in the world is in Caracas, Venezuela, because that is where Iran launders its money. Yet, even though all the evidence pointed to the contrary, the State Department issued a report that claimed that Iran's influence in Latin America is waning. Dr. Levitt, you testified at the time that the report was incomplete, full of faulty assumptions, and that the proper people were not consulted before the report was issued. This is very troubling indeed, especially this year, the 20th anniversary of the EMEA bombings on the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, that left 85 dead and hundreds more wounded. It is very troubling because it shows that the administration either doesn't have the full grasp of how dangerous Iran really is, or is choosing to be willfully ignorant of the situation. And this, of course, doesn't even include Iran's support for terrorist activity and pro-Iranian armed forces in the Middle East. Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, has been wreaking havoc throughout the region for decades and has been responsible for numerous attacks, especially its incessant and deadly attacks aimed at Israel. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force have cultivated and supported terrorist activities worldwide, providing money, arms, material, and fighters for terrorist groups all over the map. Most notably, Iran, through the IRGC, the Quds Force, and Hezbollah, has been instrumental in propping up the Assad regime in Syria. Yet none of this was part of the Joint Plan of Action, and none of this is being discussed as the administration attempts to reach a comprehensive agreement on Iran's nuclear plan. The administration is dealing with these talks as if Iran's nuclear program exists in a vacuum. as if the nuclear program is not somehow related to Iran's support for terror. And the most dangerous part of these negotiations is that the administration is willing to ignore these facts and other aspects of the regime so that it can say that it has reached a deal with Iran. That is why I think this hearing is critical, so that we can draw attention to the true nature of the regime in Tehran. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, my good friend from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, for holding today's hearing, and thank you, Chairman Royce, for joining us. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today as well, as we examine Iran's continued sponsorship of terror around the world. Despite recent renewal of direct engagement with Iran, the regime must understand that regardless of whether any progress is made on the nuclear issue, it cannot and it will not mean that the United States and our allies turn a blind eye to Iran's standing as the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. This is not simply a problem for Israel and the Middle East. In the aftermath of the Iraq War, the American public will not forget that it was Iran who was responsible for the improvised explosive devices that killed scores of American troops. Working mostly through its proxy, Hezbollah, Iran has continually targeted American citizens and our allies in every corner of the globe. From the 1983 Marine barracks bombing to the heinous 1994 bombing of the Amia Jewish Center in Argentina to the 2012 attack on Israeli tourists in Burgas, Bulgaria, to the terrorist attacks against Israeli diplomats in India and Georgia, and to thwarted plots in Thailand, Kenya, and even right here in Washington, D.C. What was once deemed a resistance movement aimed at Israel, Hezbollah, backed by millions of dollars in Iranian funding, has transformed into a global organization with no reservations of striking anywhere in the world. This behavior, according to a 2013 State Department report, has seen a marked increase in recent years. In addition to masterminding attacks around the world, Iran has been steadily expanding its global network of terror financing by fostering relationships in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Hezbollah receives a large portion of its funding through activities in Latin America, primarily in areas with large Shiite diasporas. And during the Ahmadinejad presidency, the regime weaseled its way into America's backyard, aligning itself with anti-American leaders in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. We all remember the pictures that Chairman Ros-Lehtinen placed around this room of Ahmadinejad embracing his Latin American friends on his tour of tyrants. Thank you, Madam Chairman, for coining that phrase. For years, Ahmadinejad traveled the world announcing with great fanfare millions of dollars of investments in infrastructure and trade deals. $350 million for a seaport in Nicaragua, $120 million in resources to support the construction of 6 water treatment plants in Sudan, $30 million to conduct joint mining projects in Ecuador. Iran and Algeria agreed to create a 220 million euro cement plant in Algeria, together owned 51% by Iran. And while many of these projects never came to fruition, they laid the groundwork for attracting those who may be sympathetic to Iran's intolerable death to America mantra. It remains to be seen whether the more understated Rouhani will seek to further expand these relationships. And while Rouhani has seemed to show some desire to mend Iran's international image, many of us question whether he has any influence over the fundamental objectives of this regime. This is why perhaps Iran's most troubling behavior has been the supreme leader's unwavering support for the murderous Assad regime in Syria. Despite the tremendous economic strain international sanctions have placed on the Iranian economy, this regime has chosen to spend billions of dollars sustaining Assad's grip on power instead of taking care of its own people. For the past 3 years, Iran, working through its proxy Hezbollah and even directly through its elite Quds force, has been funneling money, arms, and manpower directly into Syria. Iran also continues to be the largest funder of aggression toward our ally Israel. The regime funds Hamas and Islamic Jihad, groups whose very existence is based on the destruction of the State of Israel, and who are regularly responsible for indiscriminately launching missiles at Israeli citizens. So with attention focused on the Iranian nuclear crisis, it's important that we remind the world that we have not and we will not lose sight of Iran's destabilizing actions around the globe and of its blatant and unfettered support for heinous attacks on American citizens and on our allies. Make no mistake, this Congress will not lift terrorism-related sanctions until Iran has ceased every bit of support, direct and indirect, for these despicable acts of international terror. I look to our witnesses today to provide us with a more complete picture of Iran's activities and what drives its sustained support for international terrorism. And thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. We'll now yield to Mr. Sherman of California 5 minutes for his opening remarks.
First, as to the agreement reached in Geneva, I share the chairwoman's concerns to some degree, but with anything you have to ask, compared to what? In October 2013, we had sanctions in Iran which were insufficient to stop a single centrifuge. We didn't have a great policy before this agreement. And from 1998 to 2010, 3 administrations blocked every effort of this committee to impose additional sanctions on Iran and refused to enforce, or not every effort, but virtually every effort, and refused to enforce the sanctions laws we did have. So this latest policy must be compared to our previous policy, and on that basis, it may be a step in the right direction. These hearings are held on Iranian terrorism, but with the knowledge of Iran's nuclear weapons program. We are often asked, so what's the problem with Iran having a nuclear weapon? The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and never used them. First and foremost, we're going to see terrorism with impunity. This is not a shy or reticent government. As the last 2 speakers have pointed out, we have seen Iran, knowing that it could be subject to response to retaliatory bombing attacks or whatever on its own territory from the U.S. Air Force or others, but even knowing that, they've conducted terrorist operations in Lebanon, Syria, tried to kill the ambassador here in D.C., Bulgaria, Thailand, India, Georgia, and 2 raids and more in the 1990s in Argentina. Now imagine terrorism with impunity. With this terrorism comes confrontation. Every time Hezbollah missiles rain down on Israel, Israel may respond. We saw with the Cuban Missile Crisis how these things can escalate upward. How many Cuban Missile Crises do we want to have with Iran? Do we really believe that the government in Tehran is as sane and reasonable as Khrushchev? Terrorism by a nuclear Iran will be on a large scale, will require a response, and every response is a possibility of getting out of hand. We were asked to compare North Korea's nuclear program to Iran. North Korea wants to oppress its own people. It has committed terrible acts, all of them in or within a few miles of its own territory. Whereas there is not a continent in the world, with the possible exception of Antarctica, in which Iran has not already tried to commit an act of terror. This is a regime with worldwide scope in its terrorist activities and worldwide ambitions for promoting its particular brand of an Islamic State. So if we allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, we will see a massive expansion in its already substantial terrorist activity that has already earned it from our State Department year after year the brand of the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. And, of course, this will affect Israel, but it will certainly affect the United States. How many ambassadors will be assassinated in Washington or New York by a nuclear Iran? Iran did not hesitate to kill through its proxy Hezbollah, to kill hundreds of our Marines during the Reagan administration in Lebanon. They will be even more emboldened. And so the efforts against terrorism and the efforts against a nuclear Iran coincide. Finally, Iran's greatest act of terrorism in terms of loss of life, at least outside of its own borders, is the propping up of the Assad regime. 140,000 Syrians have died. If it wasn't for Iran, Assad would be already swept into the dustbin of history. Yet there he is, and who's to say he will not kill another 140,000? And in this room, we have often said that America should not repair the supposedly civilian planes of Iran's airlines. Those planes have been used to take Quds officers, to take Hezbollah thugs to Damascus, where they kill the Syrian people. And it is time to say those planes should be grounded until Iran changes its behavior. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sherman. And both of our subcommittee, the members are very honored to have the full committee chairman with us today. Mr. Royce is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Well, let me begin by thanking Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen for the continued oversight that she and the ranking member here of this committee give on the interim agreement with Iran, and also the efforts to address this broader threat posed by the Iranian regime. You know, before I go farther, there is a delegation that I wanted to recognize here, Chairman, and that delegation, if I could ask them to stand, are from Indonesia, and this is part of the legislative partnership program we have in 2014 for those who work in the legislature in Indonesia. We were in Jakarta in August, and I had an opportunity to meet many of them, and we are very proud of the relationship with Indonesia and this legislative exchange. Thank you very much for being with us. Also, I just wanted to say our former colleague, Chairman Hoekstra, will remember on this broader theme the comment that Dick Armitage once made to the intelligence community, which was that Hezbollah may be the A team of terrorists, but in fact, Al-Qaeda is actually the B team, because Hezbollah, of course, controlled by Iran, is the major challenge as we look at terrorism worldwide. And there's two aspects of this. One is Iran's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons capability. That's one of the greatest threats to U.S. security, to our interests in the Middle East, certainly to our allies. But the nuclear aspect there of this threat is only one aspect of the challenge that we face, because too often overlooked is this equally important role of Iran's terrorist activities. And we should remember that our sanctions, which we implemented, including the most effective oil and financial sanctions back in 2012, those of us on this committee worked many, many years to try to advance this concept of sanctions, and they exist not only because of Iran's nuclear program, but also because of Iran's terror program. And Iran's status as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism is very well deserved for those of us who regularly sit through these briefings of assassinations done, you know, in Europe, in Central Asia, South Asia, conducted by Iran, and not just external, but assassinations and executions inside the country. I think one of the things that's most disturbing to many of us is the fact that the executions have actually increased in Iran here under Rouhani. President Rouhani as head of state. We see an increase in the number of religious leaders and political leaders who are being taken out and executed. This regime, this Islamic Republic as a regime, foments bloodshed, promotes chaos, not just in the West Bank, not just in Gaza, not just, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just in Lebanon. And I'll just make a note about Lebanon. I was there during the Second Lebanon War, and I watched those Iranian-made and Syrian-made rockets come crashing into civilian neighborhoods. We were at the trauma hospital. 600 victims of this kind of state sponsor of terrorism. And afterwards, when the ID badges were found, who had been on the ground helping Hezbollah launch these things? Iranian intelligence agents. So, you know, as their meddling increases, our U.S. allies, our partners in the region, such as Bahrain, which they're trying to topple, Saudi Arabia, and there's a Shia minority there, and regularly Iran tries to kindle that low-level insurgency out there. Yemen, which ambassadors, Middle Eastern ambassadors tell me is that close to being toppled, they bear the brunt of an emboldened Iran, and so that's why we need to keep the pressure on. And unfortunately, the scope of those plans continue to grow as successive administrations, and in my view, this has been a problem in administrations of both political parties. They have been reluctant to forcefully respond, including the subdued response in the face of Iranian proxies killing American soldiers in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I would make one point here. Dagdug is a Hezbollah member, a mastermind of the attack in January of 2007, which resulted in the deaths of 5 U.S. servicemen in Iraq. Disguised as U.S. military personnel in black SUVs, Iranian-backed operatives opened fire on our 5 U.S. servicemen there. 1 died immediately. 4 others were captured by these agents. They were brutally tortured, and then they were executed. Dagdug, by the way, was handed over to the Iraqi government. And of course, he was eventually, unfortunately, released to Lebanon. Allowing his release was a gross failure by the administration. And I would just also quote our former CENTCOM commander, General James Mattis. He said, he criticized the administration's weak response in dealing with the Iranian plot to assassinate the ambassador of Saudi Arabia here. And in 2013, he said, they actually set out to do it. It was not a rogue agent off on his own. This decision was taken at the very highest levels in Iran. Again, absent one mistake, they would have murdered Abdel and the Americans at the restaurant a couple of miles from the White House. Referencing the real threat Iran poses to the U.S., Mattis also stated that while he was overseeing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the first thing I asked my briefers about when I woke up every morning was Iran, Iran, Iran. Now, I would point out it's not just Americans that would have lost their lives in that attempted bombing, because I've talked to many Middle Eastern ambassadors who say it was not just the Saudi ambassador that lunches at the Cafe Milano. They said, when this operative is quoted as saying that 100 dead would just be collateral damage, as ambassadors, several of them told me, we were the collateral damage that he's talking about when he was attempting to target the Saudi ambassador. So I think that very unfortunately, the scope of their plans, as I said, continues to grow. The response is ineffectual, and unfortunately the current administration shares this limited vision of how we respond to Iran. The Obama administration did little in these cases of trying to really clamp down on the Iranian regime, and the administration has failed to recognize or effectively address Iran's support for Hezbollah, which is fighting for Assad, as you know, in Syria. And meanwhile, Iran is spreading its use of Islamist terrorist proxies, as Chairman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen has pointed out, not only across Africa and the Middle East, but also to Latin America. It's worrying that they would use these new footholds to destabilize other states and again launch terrorist attacks against U.S. interests, and this hearing raises an important concern. And this is what I'd like the members to just reflect on for a minute. If this is what Iran is doing today without a nuclear weapon, what will Iran do if it's ever emboldened with a bomb? We cannot afford to find out. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I will now recognize members for 1-minute opening statements, and we will begin with Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Lowenthal passes. We will go to Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Chairman Poe and Ranking Members Deutsch and Ranking Member Sherman for holding today's joint hearing on this very important issue. The continuing threat that Iran poses to international stability is of paramount concern to the United States and our allies, and all those who care about freedom, rule of law, and the ongoing fight against global terrorism. And addressing that threat must continue to be a top priority of United States foreign policy. Even as we continue to monitor negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program, we must also address other risks, especially how Iran has and continues to support terrorism in the region and around the world. We must make a concerted effort to better understand the violence that is currently occurring in the Middle East and how the United States can predict, identify, and prevent terrorism, and ultimately support peaceful democracy in the region. The message that we must send must be very clear. Although our recent focus has been on nuclear weapons, terrorism will not be tolerated. The United States will stand on the side of democracy and freedom and do all we can, working with our partners, to prevent terrorism around the world. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of the witnesses this morning and thank the Chair for calling this important meeting as we discuss Iran's support of terrorism around the world. I thank the Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. And now we'll recognize Mr. Brooks.
Thank you. In 1817, Thomas Jefferson stated that, quote, "Knowledge is power and knowledge is safety," end quote. I'd like to thank the chair of these subcommittees for conducting this hearing on terrorist activities and threats posed by Iran. America has been somewhat blindsided by recent Syrian events and blindsided by recent Ukrainian events, resulting in loss of life and, quite frankly, ineffectual preventive policies. Hopefully, this hearing will illuminate and provide the kind of knowledge that is needed to develop effective policies that thwart the terrorist goals of the Iranian regime and help preserve peace throughout the world.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. Mr. Vargas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I want to thank you again for holding this hearing, as well as the ranking member and the chair of the full committee. As you know, I've been very critical of the interim agreement that we've had with Iran. I think it's based on a very naive view of Iran and actually probably a naive view of the world. So I think it's been a mistake to relax sanctions on Iran. I think we need to strengthen and tighten them. I think that they were working. They just needed to be stronger. And I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. In fact, I think we've heard from Rouhani himself that he got us at the negotiating table. So I'm not, at the moment, not very positive about the direction that we're going, but I'm very happy that we're holding this hearing to take a look at all the other terroristic acts that this nation has done around the world. But again, I hope we don't lose focus on a nuclear Iran, because I think that's really the most important thing. It's good to look at all these other issues, but I think the greatest threat to our security is a nuclear Iran, and I hope we don't lose focus on that. Thank you.
Thanks
again.
Sir. Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I also want to thank you for having this hearing. I look forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say, and it's somewhat ironic. I think a few people realize that I've addressed the Beirut bombing in 1983. It has a special place in my heart. That was my former battalion in the Marine Corps, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and a number of friends, colleagues, Marines died there. And the situation has, quite frankly, only gotten worse in terms of Hezbollah and the Iranian proxies that are all over the world. So thank you very much again for having this here.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the chairs and the ranking members for holding this hearing at, as was previously mentioned, a critical time. Iran is a worldwide sponsor of terrorism. They have funded or committed acts in countries, literally, as said before, on every continent. As we get into the questions, I look forward to what the witnesses have to say. But in particular, what I look for is understanding how their funding has affected other terrorist groups within the regions of the world, including here in the Western Hemisphere. And in particular, as we get into it, understanding how those relationships have changed in some of the remarks previously submitted from proxy to partnerships and what that partnership means to us. It is an issue that we'll be facing for a long time. We need to have policy that's structured on understanding and knowledge. So again, I thank you for this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and much of what has been laid out today sets forth the foundation for what we're here to deal with and what I look forward to hearing from you. I'd make 2 points. For the American people that are watching, the connection between Hezbollah and Iran is undeniable. Going back to 1982, and some estimated $6 billion have now been funneled into terrorist activities through that, at the direction of Iran. Even the second in command of Hezbollah admits that they get their directions from Iran. And the second part, and the Ukraine shows us this, is that foreign policy in action is not like a fine wine. It doesn't improve with time. So I look forward to hearing from each one of you what actions specifically we can take in encouraging the administration on a foreign policy that actually addresses this issue. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Cotton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for addressing us on this very important topic. Nuclear Iran is the gravest threat we face from Iran, but the terrorist threat that Iran poses does have 2 important links to it. Obviously, it reveals the soul of the regime and what they think of freedom and freedom-loving peoples everywhere. They've killed numerous Americans around the world through their terrorist activities, to include some of my comrades in arms in Iraq when I was a platoon leader there, through the export of explosively formed projectiles, a particularly lethal kind of IED that killed many American troops. Second, a nuclear Iran would be operating with a massive deterrent that would only embolden its terrorist activities around the world. So I do very much appreciate the Chair for holding the hearing and our witnesses today for addressing this important topic.
Thank you again for your service, Mr. Cotton. And we are so pleased to now present our panelists. We welcome our former U.S. Congressman, our dear colleague, Pete Hoekstra. He's currently a Shillman Senior Fellow at the Investigative Project on Terrorism. Pete served as a member of Congress from Michigan for 18 years, and in 2004, he was named chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And in this role, he helped lead congressional oversight of U.S. intelligence as this adapted to the challenges on the global war on terror. Prior to his appointment as chair, he chaired the Subcommittee on Technical and Tactical Intelligence. In January 2011, the Director of National Intelligence awarded Chairman Hoekstra the National Intelligence Distinguished Public Service Medal. Welcome back, Pete. And next, we will welcome Dr. Matthew Levitt. Thank you, Dr. Levitt, who is the former Wexler Fellow and Director of the Washington Institute Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. Dr. Levitt brings extensive experience in counterterrorism and intelligence, serving from 2005 to 2007 as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, at the State Department as Counterterrorism Director to General James L. Jones, and as a Counterterrorism Intelligence Analyst at the FBI. Welcome, Dr. Levitt. And lastly, Mr. Matthew McInnes, welcome to our subcommittees. He is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Iran, regional security issues in the Persian Gulf, and the effectiveness of U.S. intelligence. Prior to this, he served as a senior analyst and in other leadership positions for the Department of Defense. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Your entire testimony will be made part of the record, and please feel free to summarize in 5 minutes. We will start with Chairman Hoekstra. Welcome back, Pete.
Chairwoman, thank you very much. Ranking Members Deutsch and Sherman, and distinguished members of the committee. It's nice to be back, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to testify today. I've had the opportunity to work with many of you. Appreciate your bipartisan approach to developing effective U.S. foreign policy. From my work on the Intelligence Committee, I know how hard foreign affairs is and the number of unknowns that one must deal with. In that context, I congratulate you on your efforts, and it's absolutely essential. The world is looking for America to speak with a single, strong, and unified voice. Today, there's so much to say and so little time to say it. Let me summarize my written testimony. I believe that you need to look at international events in a broad context over a period of time. What happens in Iran doesn't stay in Iran. It has global ramifications. Iran has had a long and dark past. For over 30 years, Iran has faced sanctions for a variety of reasons: the hostage crisis, the bombing of the Marine barracks, financial aid for terrorism, a ballistic missile program, its nuclear program. Sanctions have always been about the breadth of Iran's behavior. They've never been narrowly focused. We've all witnessed Iran's terrorist activities and growing sphere of influence around the world, reaching our doorstep and actually reaching into the United States. This is of immense concern. It's all been well documented. From the killing of U.S. Marines in Lebanon to attempting to assassinate a foreign ambassador in Washington, D.C., Iran's past is dark. There's no debate about that. But what can we expect in the future? I believe that Iran can be expected to continue its past activities aggressively, especially in South and Central America. With the easing of sanctions, there's no pressure to change. More importantly, as I prepared this testimony last week, I didn't anticipate the events that occurred this weekend. What happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. I was going to focus on two more transformational possibilities: fundamental changes that would radically alter the national security calculus between the United States and Iran. These two areas for fundamental change are Iranian cyber capabilities and Iran developing a closer relationship with Russia. First, let me talk about Iran's cyber warfare capability. Cyber reaches globally. It crosses borders effortlessly. In cyber world, it's hard to identify attackers. It's difficult to defend against, and a cyber attack can have a significant impact. Iran recognizes this. They've made a significant commitment to develop cyber capabilities, and they're doing it successfully. In a very short period of time, Iran has moved from a Tier 2, Tier 3 capability to being almost world-class in the cyber area, nipping at the heels of the United States, Russia, China, and Israel. Iran has used these capabilities to hack into U.S. financial institutions and even our own defense establishment. Even as Iran has increased its cyber capabilities, General Keith Alexander, the head of U.S. Cyber Command, admits that the United States may not be fully prepared to defend itself against a cyber attack. The cyber threat is real and it's worrisome. Finally, the events of the weekend ensure that Iran and Russia will develop a much closer relationship. It has moved from if to how fast and how far that relationship will grow. Russia and Iran both have so much to gain from more significant cooperation. I think the immediate impacts will be profound. The P5+1 talks, which were difficult to begin with, I think the President even himself admitted that there were perhaps a 50-50 chance of success. The events of the weekend, I think, make it almost impossible for us to expect that the P5+1 talks on Iran's nuclear program will be successful. Reimposing sanctions will be difficult, if not impossible. Russia will continue to support and increase its assistance to Iran's cyber program as Iran continues to develop offensive and defensive capabilities. And that's just the immediate impact of closer cooperation. Where does that leave us? Israel and Hezbollah's past is dark. Iran's increasing cyber capabilities and its closer relationship with Russia foreshadows an even darker future. That concludes my testimony. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Chairman Hoekstra. Dr. Levitt.
Madam Chairwoman, ranking members, members of the subcommittees, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify before you today. This hearing is indeed timely. Over the past few years, Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism has increased dramatically to levels not seen since the late 1980s and early 1990s. Some of this terrorism is carried out by Iran's own Quds Force. Some of it is carried out by Hezbollah, its primary proxy, or others. Some of it is the two of them together, and this should not surprise. We no longer see the Iranian-Hezbollah relationship as a proxy patron relationship, but as a strategic partnership with Iran as the primary partner, to quote senior U.S. intelligence officials, and that makes all the difference. Events in Syria today have further cemented this partnership with dire consequences for regional and international security. In 2012, the State Department talked about this market increase, and we had, of course, the plot at Cafe Milano that several of you have mentioned already. But I want to point out that senior law enforcement officials at the time noted, though few have picked up on it, that this was only one of a number of violent missions Iranian operatives discussed carrying out at the time. Over the past year, the operational tempo of the types of plots we saw around the world by Hezbollah and Iran appear to have decreased significantly. And some suggest that this might have to do with the election of President Rouhani, who's a relatively more moderate, the subsequent negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, and maybe that has played some peripheral role. But I think that the main reason that we're seeing this drawback is actually because Iran and Hezbollah are all in their investment in defense of the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. They are completely absorbed in what they see as an existential battle. And this battle, by the way, from their perspective has, well, from any perspective, has clearly yielded results. Whereas U.S. intelligence predicted early on that the Syrian rebellion, that the Assad regime's days were numbered, that assessment was quickly revisited once Iran convinced Hezbollah to go in and support the Assad regime as it has all in. They just don't have the bandwidth to simultaneously prosecute this kind of global asymmetric battle and do what they're doing in Syria, which is paramount for them at the same time. But Iranian surveillance and terrorist plots continue around the world. So, for example, in September 2013, an Iranian with Belgian citizenship was arrested for conducting surveillance outside the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. In July 2013, 7 Iranians were caught using fake Israeli passports at Vancouver International Airport. And 2 months later, 3 men, 1 Iranian, and we believe 2 possibly Eastern Europeans were arrested at the Brussels airport, again with forged Israeli passports, attempting to fly to Toronto and Montreal. As I explained in my written testimony, more standard Iranian state sponsorship of terrorism continues around the world. U.S. Treasury designations have recently noted that IRGC Quds Force operatives in Afghanistan were planning to carry out attacks there, that Mahan Air, which had already been designated by Treasury designated more affiliates, not because of the proliferation issue, but because these elements were facilitating the shipment of cargo to the Syrian regime. In Yemen, there have been all kinds of weapons shipments to the Houthi rebels, and in Bahrain, this continues. Indeed, just yesterday, we had a bombing killing 3 policemen, 2 Bahrainis and an Emirati. And today, just this morning, the chief of Dubai police has said, according to their information, at least one of the bombers got his training from Hezbollah in Lebanon. Of course, Iran continues to undermine the peace process, not only through Hamas. That relationship was badly damaged, but now there's the beginning of a rapprochement between the two, but increasingly Palestinian Islamic Jihad. State Department just designated the Deputy Secretary General of Islamic Jihad. He went to Iran, quite proudly was received. There was just another attack, or attempted attack yesterday, and the Israelis bombed someone, an Islamic Jihad operative who was trying to fire rockets at Israel at the time. But of course, the main issue right now is, as I mentioned, Syria, and not just Syria, but the implications for the region, and in particular for Lebanon. Most people talk about the Sunni foreign fighter phenomenon, and that's very important, but there are at least as many Shia foreign fighters in Iraq, and most of them are Iraqi foreign fighters, but not only. Bahrainis, Yemenis, Afghans, and others, and this is a huge, huge problem. The bottom line is that with Hezbollah and Iran in Syria, and with Iranian terrorism continuing around the world, it's important to take a step back. I think that it's important to note that Iran sees terrorism, political violence, and other militant activities as policy tools that are no less, no more legitimate than any other means of affecting their foreign, or for that matter, domestic policy concerns. It should therefore not surprise that even under the regime of President Rouhani, and even as Tehran engages in the P5+1 talks over its nuclear program, Iran's support for terrorism continues. This should not surprise at all. Time and again, Iran has found such activities to be both effective and financially and politically inexpensive, without cost. Moving forward, Washington and our allies, the P5+1 and beyond, must find credible ways of communicating to Iran that continuing to engage in such activities will incur a heavy price. In the context of current events, that might be difficult to do, but failure to do so guarantees a far less stable region with dire consequences for regional and international security. Thank you very much.
Dr. Levitt. Mr. McInnes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Members Deutsch and Sherman and other distinguished members of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs for inviting me to testify today and on highlighting the importance of this issue. If the U.S. is to develop more effective policies against Iranian-backed terrorism, we first need to understand why Iran pursues these activities. I believe there are two primary reasons. First, terrorism helps protect the regime. The Iranian threat network, which includes the IRGC, Quds Force, Hezbollah, and Iran's proxies in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, serve as both a deterrent and a retaliatory weapon. Tehran recognizes its conventional military capabilities are inadequate to deter the U.S. and other powers, and it uses terrorism to compensate for this relative weakness. Second, the Iranian threat network is the backbone and primary vehicle for the spread of Iran's revolutionary ideas and its political, economic, and security resistance to the West, Israel, and our Arab allies. The Islamic Republic must successfully propagate its ideology and its soft power. Otherwise, the legitimacy of the entire regime comes into question. This is why maintaining and expanding its proxy forces and subversive activities in the region and globally is an existential issue for Tehran, even perhaps more so than having a nuclear weapons capability. Its foreign policies will, by definition, continue to obstruct American national interest, regardless of the results of the current negotiations towards a comprehensive nuclear agreement. The recent escalation in the activity of the IRGC and Quds Force, as Dr. Levitt has noted, is a response to the Arab Spring, the Syrian civil war, and the growing confrontation over Iran's nuclear program. Prior to 2011, Iran could use Syria as its primary forward operating base in the Middle East without paying substantial costs. However, Tehran can no longer maintain this on the cheap. Iran will have great difficulty in deterring Israel, projecting power in Levant, maintaining its crown jewel of Lebanese Hezbollah, keeping its enemies occupied away from its border, and justifying the ideological tenets of the regime's foreign policy if Syria is lost. The IRGC and the Quds Force are also likely girding themselves for an escalating sectarian conflict in the region, stemming from the proxy war in Syria. This could include a possible end to the relative détente Iran has had with al-Qaeda and other Sunni extremist groups since 9/11. And as we may be seeing in the recent terrorist attacks against Iranian and Hezbollah diplomatic and other targets in Lebanon and Pakistan. I believe the need to prioritize resources on the sectarian fight is also a contributing factor for the regime's desire to find a deal on the nuclear program that would relieve sanctions and Western pressure. Finally, heightened fears of a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities over the past 3 years have likely driven the Quds Force to expand its presence and retaliatory capabilities. As we proceed with the current nuclear negotiations, it will be interesting to see if the Quds Force begins to maintain a lower profile outside of Syria. The Supreme Leader has made clear, though, that any agreement on the nuclear program will not change its resistance efforts against the U.S. and our allies. So what should we do? I believe the U.S. should develop a much more comprehensive policy employing both direct counterterrorism and competitive strategies using both soft and hard power to blunt the IRGC and the Quds Force. The direct approaches are fairly straightforward. The U.S. needs a more focused and coordinated structure inside the government to target and undermine the Iranian threat network. In particular, this means going after their financial networks, working with partners to expose operatives and illicit activities around the world, and challenge Lebanese Hezbollah and the IRGC more aggressively in Syria. As I examine in more depth in my written testimony, effective competitive strategies also offer us an opportunity to undermine Iran's confidence in its own policies while more efficiently using our resources and avoiding direct conflict. Taking advantage of our economic and military strengths, we should look to induce self-defeating behavior in Iran, such as overreach in Syria or overinvestment in protecting itself from American power. We should exploit blind spots like Iran's tendency to overestimate its ideological attraction in the Islamic world and make the region less fertile for Iran's proxies and political activities. Successfully unraveling components of Iran's hard and soft power strategies in the Levant and elsewhere in the world would radically increase Western leverage to address the full spectrum of our concerns with the Iranian regime. It would also offer the best chance of eventually pushing the regime towards becoming a state that no longer seeks to undermine its neighbors, subvert the international system, and use terrorism and violence to achieve its foreign policy goals. Such a fundamental change in the nature of the Iranian state would be a far greater benefit to our interest than even checking Tehran's nuclear program or expanding conventional military capabilities. We need such policies, and thank you again for inviting me here today.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for excellent testimony. I will begin the question aspect of this hearing. Mr. McInnes, you testify that everything Iran does, its soft power, hard power, projections, they're all interconnected and related to its revolutionary nature. Iran's foreign policy is related to its external and internal politics and is related to its diplomatic, economic, and security activity. And you say that its threat of terror, proxy warfare, and its nuclear weapons program all serve as enablers of its objective, which is all of them counter to U.S. goals. So my first question for all of our witnesses is this: how can we continue to negotiate with an Iranian regime over its nuclear program while setting aside the fact that it is the world's foremost state sponsor of terror, even though Iran continues to engage in these terrorist activities, by ignoring all other aspects of the Iranian regime's nefarious and illicit activities while continuing to negotiate over the nuclear program? How difficult has it made it for the United States and other responsible nations, our allies, to counter any of Iran's terrorist activities? And we've heard from all of you that the tempo of Iran's support for terrorism has seen a resurgence over the last few years, whether it be through its proxies like Hezbollah or directly through IRGC or Quds Force. Iran is seeking to expand its terrorist network globally. What has the United States been doing to counter Iran's expansion and growing influence, especially in the U.S. and Western Hemisphere? And what more can we do or should we be doing? And Chairman Hoekstra, you testified that the Iranian regime is seeking to expand its terrorist activities to incorporate cyber attacks. We've become more and more concerned about the threat of cyber attacks, not only because of how harmful they can be and their ability to impact millions of people, but because of how vulnerable our national infrastructure are to these cyber attacks. And just last week, General Keith Alexander, commander of the U.S. Cyber Command, testified to the Senate Armed Service Committee that the U.S. does not yet have a line drawn in the sand that would prompt a U.S. response for a cyber attack, and that our ability to stop terrorist attacks is actually going down. So just how far advanced and sophisticated do you believe Iran's cyber warfare program to be? What would a cyber attack from Iran look like, and what are the consequences of failing to address this threat? We will begin with Mr. McInnes from the first questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Regarding on the issues of negotiating with Iran on the nuclear program in the context of what it's still supporting for terrorism, I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to understand is what's driving Iran to the table over the last few months. And even though I think I am highly suspicious of Iran's intentions and its fidelity in its negotiations, as certainly shared by the rest of the committee here, in the end, Iran is looking for a way out on certain issues right now. And I think Iran is in a position, especially when it comes to its economic as well as what it may be facing in the region, and the war in Syria is the best example of this, that it has a lot of problems right now, and it needs to find a way to get out of the pressure from the sanctions and from the U.S. So I am certainly not opposed to pushing Iran to get to a point where we can where we can verify that it is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. I don't have a lot of confidence in how that we're going to be able to get there, but I don't think necessarily that they would be two separate things. I think what we would need to be doing is a full spectrum approach pushing against the nuclear program, pushing against terrorism, pushing against Iran's soft power efforts to spread its cultural, religious, and economic influence around the region. That's something that all needs to be done part and parcel. I can't see how you would separate them, though I obviously recognize that from a diplomatic standpoint, it is challenging to do both tracks at the same time, but I think we need to find a way to do that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Levitt?
You hit the nail on the head. This is the $60 million question, and I think the bottom line is this. The nuclear threat is the most severe threat. It's by no means the only one. I think if we try and put everything on the table at once, we're guaranteeing failure. As we've all said, the likelihood of failure is still very, very high. But I'm not so concerned about whether or not we're insisting that this is being negotiated publicly at the table. First of all, we know that some things beyond the nuclear program, missiles in particular, have been brought up. Iranian officials and others have said this publicly. But the fact that we now talk in government about the Iran Threat Network, the ITN, when something gets an acronym in government, you know you've gotten somewhere. When I was in the Treasury Department and they started talking about FININT, financial intelligence, we knew that as a discipline within the intelligence community, we'd gotten somewhere. There is a lot, actually, that is happening, but it tends to happen quietly. The one thing that happens publicly is exposures. So, for example, I'm very proud that my former department, the Treasury Department, continues to expose Iran's illicit conduct around the world, including things that you might consider to be quite sensitive. So, for example, the fact that al-Qaeda is playing both sides. Iran, that is playing both sides. Obviously, they're defending the Assad regime in huge ways in Syria, and yet Treasury just exposed that they're allowing al-Qaeda to use Iran as a transit point for funding and supporting its network from within Iran, so long as al-Qaeda didn't carry out attacks in Iran to fund who? Jabhat al-Nusra. This is huge, and we've done a lot diplomatically as well. So, for example, when weapons shipments from Iran through Iraq were caught going to Bahrain, it wasn't U.S. officials who were out there saying, hey, this is a problem. It was Europeans, and that's great. The European Union has banned the military and terrorist wings of Hezbollah, not as much as we'd have liked, but it's a good step. The GCC has done things. And in fact, we have had a shadow war with Iran over primarily its nuclear program, which suggests that actually under this administration, some of the covert things have been going on quite nicely. So I don't think it's fair to say nothing's going on, but we do need, and it's why I started my testimony by saying this is so timely, we do need to have public discussions about how important this is and how, it's not a very Western way of thinking, but Iran continues to push this envelope even as it's sitting at the table.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. Chairman Hoekstra.
Thank you, Chairwoman. A couple of things here. I think as I listen to the opening statements of the members, I share their concern that breaking the nuclear program off from all of the other activities that Iran has been engaged in is very, very concerning. Not knowing the parameters, or the public not knowing what the parameters of what those negotiations may or may not include, is also of concern. You may remember back in 2007, you and I co-authored an op-ed piece, and we wanted the Bush administration at that time to release the details of the attack against the Syrian nuclear plant. And this was some months after that, because we wanted the American people to know about the potential relationship between Iran and Syria, and that this facility had actually been taken out. The third thing that you asked about was, what are the cyber capabilities of Iran? And coming from the intelligence world, we've always been concerned about how little we actually know about Iran, whether it's its nuclear program or its cyber capabilities. But what we do know at this time, it has launched cyber attacks against the U.S., it's launched them against Saudi Arabia, it's launched them against a number of other entities around the world. Also, as experts have taken a look at their programs, they've said in a very short period of time, and a surprising, and that's always a concern in the intelligence community when you hear a surprise. But what they said 2 or 3 years ago, Iran was a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 capability. And today, they've closed that gap dramatically. So there's two things that we're concerned about. How quickly they did it, and more importantly, who helped them do it? Because we believe that they probably didn't do this on their own. And the most likely candidate for that is the cooperation that they have with Russia. What would a cyber attack look like against the United States? We've seen other people hacking into the systems, whether it's Target or something like that. I don't think that's what we would see. You would see something perhaps that would cause an economic disruption, which would be an attack against some of our financial institutions, our financial markets, or those types of things, or potentially against our infrastructure. The scary thing there is they have the capability to do that. We don't necessarily have the means to defend it, as General Alexander recently said. And the third thing is, if something like that occurred, it would be very, very difficult to pinpoint exactly who the perpetrators would be. It could be Iran, but it might be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to track it back to Iran.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And now we'll turn to my Florida colleague, Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member of our subcommittee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. McInnes and Dr. Levitt, you both talked about the current state of negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue and the fact that the Iranians want to get out of the pressure of sanctions. Everything can't be on the table at once. I'd actually like to talk about how to keep up the pressure on the terror piece of this, even as these talks continue. And I suppose, Dr. Levitt, the first question is for you. Are the current sanctions effective enough, the sanctions that are aimed at terror financing, are they strong enough? Are there holes in the sanctions regime, particularly when it comes to Hezbollah? And though Iran ultimately would like to come out of, there's no question, would like to come out of the pressure of sanctions altogether, there is every reason, as for all the reasons that we've discussed here, there's every reason for us to continue to ratchet up the pressure on Iran with respect to its support of terror. How else can we do that? Where are the holes, and what else can we do to strengthen those sanctions?
Thanks so much for your question, Mr. Deutsch. As a former Treasury official, are sanctions enough? Sanctions have gotten us very far, but there's always room for improvement. The whole nature of sanctions is that you take an action and you see how they react or try and evade. You take another action. There's a little bit of cat and mouse to this. And of course, it also can't be done in isolation. Sanctions will never solve your problem. They will be effective if they're used in a wise way with other tools. Specifically with Hezbollah and Iran, I'd make these two comments. On Iran, as Chairman Hoekstra said, we need to be particularly focused on how they are trying to make relationships abroad to evade banking and other sanctions, to move money around the world. We've seen some things in South America that have been disconcerting. Treasury's been on top of that, but this will continue. The other thing in Iran that's always a problem is kind of the boneyard system of these, these foundations, these massive foundations that lack any transparency whatsoever. The fact is Hezbollah is consistently able to, Iran is consistently able to use these types of entities and front companies around the world to finance Hezbollah and others, and this is something we need to look at. In terms of Hezbollah, I think actually we're having a very good effect on Hezbollah's financing, in part because some of the measures we're taking on Iran. At least twice we know over the past few years, Iran has had to suddenly, for a temporary period of time, cut back their financing of Hezbollah, and that really upset Hezbollah. Hezbollah has branched out even more than it ever has into the criminal world, and that gives us great opportunities. I would love to see more U.S. government actions targeting their black and white, open and shut criminal activity. Some see this as a sensitive thing to target, in part because we're in negotiations over the P5+1. I think we need to be more like Iran. They're willing to push the envelope, even as they sit at the table on illicit conduct. We should be willing to push the envelope on holding them accountable for that illicit conduct, even as we sit at the table as well.
Right, so when you talk about focusing on the criminal area, where? I mean, specifically, what else needs to be done? Where should that focus be?
Drugs. Narcotics in particular. This is the single area where they're able to make the most money in the shortest period of time. Not production, but moving product from South America to Africa, then elsewhere, and also laundering the proceeds of that product. And there are investigations that are ongoing.
In the area of banking sanctions against financial institutions, can you, actually any of you, can you contrast the sanctions that exist with respect to the nuclear area and sanctions that exist for terror funding. Do the sanctions that are in place with respect to Hezbollah and terror funding go as far as in the energy area, the nuclear area, and if not, why not?
That's a hearing unto itself. But in a nutshell, the vast majority—
About 45 seconds.
The vast majority of the banking sanctions are technically proliferation sanctions. Sadarat is the example, the only one I can think of right now that's actually a terrorism basis. But it's not like Hezbollah uses this bank for terrorism and this bank for proliferation, and whatever the reason, it has the impact across the board. The nature of the financial sanctions is that they will look for other ways to move their money. The nature of the oil and gas sanctions is that it's much more difficult for them to do that, the nature of that economy. And so we have to look for these small mom and pop banks or other means that they might move their money. I'm less concerned with which executive order is used, terrorism or proliferation or others, to effect the change.
Mr. McInnes, just before you respond, I may have an additional minute here, Madam Chairman.
Without objection, we can all go over.
I don't know, you didn't intentionally gloss over that, but I just want to I want to back up for 1 second. You said most of the banking sanctions that exist now are focused on proliferation. And we've been having, and when we have those discussions here about how successful they've been, what other sanctions could be put in place, legislation that we passed last summer was meant to do that, but those do have to do with proliferation. Why don't we have, or couldn't the same sort of sanctions regime with respect to terror financing work? Why would we draw that distinction between proliferation and terror financing? Mr. McInnes or Dr. Levitt?
More often than not, it just has to do with what information is most readily available without declassifying really sensitive stuff that can underscore the designation. So if there's a bad bank, one of the things that will be looked at is what's the world of information that's available and what can be most easily made public and available. But it's also true that terror finance is much, much more fluid. It's much smaller amounts of money. And so it's much easier to find these bigger sums of money, these really important banks. If you find money going for terrorism through this bank today, they could just as easily do it through something else tomorrow. Whereas for oil and gas, it's a lot more difficult, and so that tends to be the reason.
Right, okay, and Dr. Levitt, I think you're referring back to your old position in that response. And Mr. McInnes, let me ask you. Here's what I'm getting at. I understand it would be tricky and certainly there would be ways to evade them. But ultimately, this is a concern, a major concern that the banks have, correct? That the notion that we would impose sanctions based strictly on terror financing on those banks, for all the reasons that you discussed, Dr. Levitt, about how it's so hard to track, that's not something that they would be comfortable with, correct?
I mean, yeah, certainly given that the connections that we suspect are there between very senior levels of the regime, especially senior levels of the IRGC, and the front companies and the other, as Dr. Levitt mentioned, the gray and black market activities that Hezbollah is engaging in Europe and globally, that's something that if they were targeted, you could go straight, in my opinion, straight for some of those key decision makers inside the regime in a way that is a little bit more difficult than on the nuclear program. And I think that's actually potentially one of the most lucrative things that we could do. One thing I would want to point out as well in relationship to the nuclear negotiations is I think we, as I was mentioning before about Iran's relative weakness, why it may be coming to the table right now, I think we underestimate our leverage that we have against Iran right now, and I think we can actually push things further. And I agree with the other panelists here that we have more room to push during the negotiations, and I think, and tied in with this issue, exposing more of what Iran is doing, especially the illicit activities that Hezbollah, as well as senior leadership within the IRGC and the regime are doing, that undermines the moral foundation and the ground that Iran is trying to promote, which it has frankly lost quite a bit in the last few years within the Islamic world. Ever since the 2006 Lebanon war, it's been pretty downhill for Iran and its image within the Middle East. And this is something that we can take advantage of by the more exposure of what Iran is up to.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Excellent questions, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Meadows is recognized.
I want to go ahead and follow up on the line of questioning that the ranking member just provided, Dr. Levitt, if we could, because as we start to look at this, you said that it could be very problematic right now because of the P5+1 negotiations that are going on. But has not Iran distanced themselves, saying that obviously they're looking for nuclear capability for peaceful purposes, that it has nothing to do with terrorism or the potential hostile act of a nuclear bomb? So with them distancing themselves from Hezbollah, would it not be very problematic for the Iranian regime if we put additional sanctions on some of those, quote, charitable or criminal activities? They would have to come to the defense. Is that not correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Meadows. First of all, I wouldn't say that Iran is distancing itself from Hezbollah. It's distancing itself from some activities that are going on, but they are closer to Hezbollah than ever before, and they'd say that everything's context. You blow up a bus of people here, it's terrorism. You blow up a bus of people there, it's resistance. We don't accept that, needless to say, but this is
right.
But I do think, and Mr. McInnes made this point as well, that there's great utility in exposing conduct that even they would be embarrassed of. For example, as I mentioned, allowing al-Qaeda to finance for Jabhat al-Nusra within their country.
Right.
And there's lots more like that could be done, and it's my understanding that people are looking into that. This is not an idea that people haven't thought of or are ignoring.
So both you and Mr. McInnes would encourage some kind of legislative sanctions or encouragement of this administration to look at identifying Hezbollah in particular from a standpoint of those activities, because as you both have mentioned, I believe, much of that is criminal. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, car smuggling, et cetera, that doesn't just happen in a faraway region, but it is ever present not only in Latin America, but Canada and other places that we would consider much closer allies. And so you would both encourage that, and I'll start with you, Mr. McInnes.
Yes, absolutely. And certainly from our experience, and this is kind of going back to some of my previous roles and the knowledge from there, it's very difficult at times to put together the right kind of dossier that you can then on this type of effort, and then be able to publicly present it in a way that it actually has the effect that you're looking for from a soft power perspective. You can certainly go after the hard power aspects of sanctions and so forth, but it is one of the things that we're going to have to. It'll be challenging for us, though I think we should absolutely do it, to find a way to get this material out in a way that still is seen, especially in the Islamic world, as credible. And that's one of the things that is a challenge for us if we kind of have and certainly Dr. Levitt has many experiences with this. You know, if you put it out there in a U.S. press conference, it has a certain amount of weight. If we can find ways to work with partners in particular, to have them expose what's going on, you know, our allies in the region or other elements, ways to get this information out that isn't necessarily a very, you know, blunt instrument from us, that's something that I would, you know, certainly encourage, and I think it's going to take a little bit of talent to do. But I'm absolutely all for finding ways to sanction publicly. I don't think I think Iran's going to be, you know, it's not going to push Iran away from the table. They want a deal right now to get them out of the sanctions, and that's something that I think that they're going to go pretty far to get.
So how do we deal with the perception among some that do not view Hezbollah in that same vein? I mean, there are some that would view them as a charitable organization. Some, you know, as we start to look at that, and we smile about it, but, you know, you have that happening across parts of Europe. And so as we start to look at that, how do we address that? And then the other part of that is you've got one group that says they're a terrorist organization, another group that says they're a criminal organization, and yet a third that says they're charitable, and yet across jurisdictions that becomes very difficult to address. So either one of you.
Thank you for the question. First, you know, in terms of sanctions, I would just say one of the things we need to be cognizant of in the current context of what's going on is the type of sanction. The simplest thing to do that would be the most nonpartisan would be to do sanctions, follow-up sanctions on authorities that already exist, as opposed to brand new sanctions. And that can be done in a way that could potentially be very bipartisan, as opposed to coming up with brand new sanctions, which by some definitions, would be problematic for the Joint Plan of Action. The second is, you asked her about, it doesn't always have to be us. Well, we have a delegation here from Indonesia. And in my book on Hezbollah, I get into great detail about Hezbollah's activities in places like Indonesia. And the Indonesians have been great partners on this, and it would be wonderful if allies around the world, including in places where you wouldn't think Hezbollah would be, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, in Thailand, et cetera, if some of these governments were to do things to out those activities. And that's increasingly likely because while it used to be the case that, well, some saw Hezbollah as legitimate and some as illegitimate, given its activities in Syria today and the nasty sectarian nature of this conflict, that's pretty much done. And so, especially predominantly Sunni countries today, I think would be much more likely to expose Hezbollah for what it is, if only because of what it's doing in Syria. And that certainly was the case in Europe, sir. When they decided to ban the military and terrorist wings of Hezbollah, I was invited to testify before the European Parliament on this issue. For some governments, this had more to do with the Bulgaria bombing and the attempted bombing in Cyprus. For others, it had only and everything to do with what they were doing in Syria. And so, yes, while some see Hezbollah more political, at home, terrorist and criminal abroad, increasingly people are coming to the realization that it's not an either-or. Whether you like them or not, they are a political party, they are a charitable organization, they're also a militia, they're also a transnational organized criminal organization, and a terrorist group. How do you deal with a group that does all those things at once? You deal with all those things at once.
All right. I thank the patience of the chair.
Thank you. Excellent questions, Mr. Meadows. And Mr. Sherman, ranking member of TNT Subcommittee, is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Levitt, I agree with you that we have to at least use all the sanctions laws we have now. That is not only bipartisan, but I think a near universal view in Congress. And just a day after his Secretary Kerry's testimony before this committee, the administration identified another 8 to 12 organizations that were subject to sanctions. The theory of sanctions is you're going to make the regime feel that it has to choose between its nuclear program, its terrorism, its wrongful acts, and regime survival. Sanctions are a blunt instrument. They cause problems to an economy. The elites rarely suffer. Middle class suffers. Maybe everyone in a country suffers. And so, it being a blunt instrument, the question is, when you hurt a nation's economy, does that create anger at its government or solidarity with its government? We saw in South Africa that sanctions were very effective in causing an apartheid regime to decide to hand over the keys of power to the majority. We've seen many other circumstances where blockades, even bombings, et cetera, have united a populace behind their government. What can we do not to increase the economic effect of these sanctions? That'd be another question, a good one, but rather to make sure that the populace of Iran loses faith in its government, try to recreate the situations of 2009. I don't know which of our panelists wish to respond. Chairman Hofstra?
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of, as you were going through the question, my mind went back immediately to 2009, because in 2009, at least as I recall it, we did not stand up and support the folks that were involved in the Green Revolution. And, we sided and we leaned more over to the government in supporting the Iranian government. You're giving me a funny look here.
Chairman, I've asked a question about the future rather than critiquing the past.
But you have to look at the past to take a look at the future. And I, like I said when I started, I applaud the bipartisan effort and the work of this committee in the direction that they have been going. I think it is supporting the types of folks that were involved in the Green Revolution and sending that type of signal to Iran in the future that will get people to decide to join
I'd
that
like
direction
to
involved in those kinds of activities.
Go on to another question, because I'm not sure that we're as universally loved in the villages of Iran as we'd like to believe. I know that the sophisticates in Tehran that we tend to interact with are much more favorable to our position, but I want to go on to another issue. The ultimate terror attack is a nuclear attack against an American city. One possibility is we find that an MIT professor has been kidnapped, driven around Boston for a while, arrives at an apartment, is shown a nuclear weapon in an apartment he doesn't know where in New England it is, and he meets the gentleman in custody who has been promised not 72 but 720 virgins, and then appears at a press conference saying he has a note requiring that the United States Navy not be in the Gulf of Oman or the Persian Gulf, or the guy gets his 720 virgins. Another possibility is this regime is faced with a 2009 circumstance, and even worse, feels it's going to be overthrown, decides to go out with a bang against an American city. We'd like to have a strong border defense, but I suspect that people in my state will be getting marijuana, and not all of it from Colorado. We're never going to have a border defense so significant that sophisticated drug dealers can't bring in a bale of marijuana. Chairman Hofstra, is it significantly, if you can import a bale of marijuana, can you import or smuggle into our country a lead-encased nuclear weapon?
Yes.
So even if we had missile defense, unless our borders are as secure as I think they will never be, we're just months or years away from facing that as a threat. I don't know if we have any other answer. Any other comment from our other witnesses?
If I may, I'll just, on your first question, I'd say two things, if I may. First, in terms of the theory of sanctions, there are actually two theories. One, you highlighted making the regime have to choose between its illicit activity and survival. And there are ways to improve that. As you've asked, I would highlight the need to focus on human rights abuses at home. And we've done some of that, and we could be doing more. As some on the committees have mentioned in their opening statements, this continues, and this is something that does have resonance with Iranians at home. The other is, and this is where we've had much more success, the other is disruption, where we try and disrupt the means through which they get their financing to their illicit. That's different from trying to necessarily make them choose. And ironically or unfortunately, that's where we've been more successful. Not that that's bad, that's good, but it means that it's much harder to have things that hurt in the right way, as you've said, to really have to make them have a choice. We've had some success right there at the table.
I agree with you. We need to focus on our public communication to the Iranian people just as much as we focus on sanctions. And disruption, who knows who did Stuxnet, but could have been us. That disrupted their nuclear program, but we got to get them to surrender their nuclear program. Otherwise, we just set them back for a year, and then a year later, they're back. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Collins is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to continue, and I think this is, as one of the witnesses just said just a moment ago, I think there's several of these questions, and probably mine as well, that could be whole other hearings as we deal with this issue. I think I have been on record and has gone for the sanctions, and this whole P5+1 deal, to me, was not very well thought out. To me, is going down a path that is problematic, some of that being in the issue of cyber, which I want to come back to in just a few moments. But also, one of the areas that we've talked just briefly about in this hearing, but I want to hear a little bit more, is Iran's, and through Hezbollah and maybe through others, is activities in the United States. We already know from the plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, other things that we've seen. What is your feelings on that? And I know, and I can't remember, and I apologize, one of you had talked about Syria, which I do believe they're invested in Syria right now. They're trying to get other things off the plate so they can deal with that. Is there still that back thought, or has some of that been put on the back burner dealing with America, with Israelis? Because right now we have a large Israeli, population in the United States living here, working here, and doing, and then also other Middle Eastern countries. And I just want a quick thought there, and then I want to jump to something else.
Yeah, on the issue of potential threats inside the U.S., one of the things that we were at first kind of surprised by what happened with the plot against the Saudi ambassador several years ago. But when you look at how Iran sees its threat picture as well as what it's trying to do, having the ability to hit the U.S. On the homeland is something that I consider to be a fundamental objective that they're going to continue to try to have the capability to do. This goes back to also Iran's weakness asymmetrically, the balance of power that it has with the U.S. We have the capacity to hit Iran with our military anywhere in their homeland. They do not have that capacity when they're in their conventional, and that asymmetry in the battlefield that they face is one of the reasons why they drive to have the terrorist capabilities that they do. And having that ability to potentially hit our homeland provides a deterrent effect and a retaliatory effect that they don't have through conventional weapons. And it's something that I think is same reason why I see so much activity in Latin America is also part of this equation for Iran, that it needs to be able to operate here and to be able to threaten the U.S. On our home territory.
Well, I think that's, we tend to think of this threat, I think sometimes not extensionally in the sense of it's being the Middle East. It is Israel, which we have got to do, I think, frankly, a better job of, whether it be in this, with the nuclear capability program, which, they have a vested interest as long as we have as well, but also seeing this move toward infiltrating here, and we've already seen evidences of that. Switching gears just a little bit, though, in dealing with the interim agreement and on the P5+1 and the finances going cyber, Mr. Chairman, is something that disturbs me because it is the reach that they can have. They can sit inside their country, they can reach out. Is there any, by taking the pressure off on sanctions, giving them money into this, is there any indications that we're going to see not just the diversion of attention in Syria right now, but maybe expanding that cyber presence and having a little bit of freedom there? Because we're already concerned about others breaking sort of ranks with this sanction agreement, and I just want to hear some of your thoughts about that.
Well, the interesting thing with cyber is they increase their capabilities, and with all their hard power, they may be limited to what they can do in Syria. They have so much bandwidth. Hard power, they're limited to Syria. The interesting thing with cyber is they're using a whole different set of resources and capability, and it's not a resource-rich investment that they require. Once they have the capabilities, they then can again reach into Africa, they can reach into Central America, South America, but they can then also reach into the United States. They can cross those borders effortlessly, and they can create a tremendous amount of mischief using their cyber capabilities. So it gives them a whole new battlefield in which to confront their enemies.
Well, I think it's really interesting because it's something that asymmetrical, that cyber threat is something that we've worked on here on this committee, and my friend Cross Alman Schneider and I have worked on the QME or bill with Israel dealing, and we've added in cyber because we do believe it is something that needs to be addressed and going. One final, and I've got 16 seconds left. You brought up something, though, that I think, Madam Chair and others, we need to probably look into further, is the possibility of working with others in what I'll call new dynamic relationships, not basically going into areas that we've not been before, but that Sunni connection, that Indonesia connection, those, how we do that, because if you look at some of the reports coming out, the concern of Iran is shared by the Sunni neighbors. It's shared by others, and they're sitting here saying you have this Shia and other capability going on here. So I would like to, at some point, maybe we can explore that more, but I appreciate your testimony today and look forward to that. Madam Chair,
Thank you so much. Look forward to working with you on that. Mr. Lowenthal is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and to the members of the committee. I would like to focus a little bit on something that's been mentioned a little bit by, I think, tangentially, and written up quite a bit by Chairman Hoekstra and that is the Iranian presence in Western Hemisphere, in South America and in Central America. And I want to ask you to respond to a couple of things from your report that you issued that we really didn't get a chance to hear very much about. One is, you talk about the Iranian active presence and extensive network in Latin America, that in addition to enjoying strong bilateral ties and state support from governments in Cuba, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, we feel fear that El Salvador may be the next to roll out the welcome mat. I'd like to understand, I'm going to ask to understand what the extensiveness of that state support and what you and how much attention we have not been paying or should be paying to this. Another one is you also go back to a 500-page indictment or released by Alberto Niesman, who is the chief prosecutor of what took place in Argentina. In addition, you say the report has named Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, Colombia, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname as countries that have been deeply infiltrated by Iranian intelligence. I'd like to understand how deeply and how much we really have to be concerned. And then the final one is you mentioned also and others about Hezbollah providing technology for the increasingly sophisticated narco tunnels that are now being found along the U.S.-Mexican border, which strongly resemble the types used in Hezbollah and Lebanon. Is there independent evidence to indicate that we really have along our border Hezbollah doing that, or is that just speculation more? And so I'm kind of, anything that you have to do to focus on really the dangers of this increased terrorism in our hemisphere. I think a number of members have talked about it, but really not as focused as I'd really like to hear from you, and any other members.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for what you've done so far.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I would encourage this committee and for these members to perhaps have a session with the Intelligence Committee and perhaps have access to certain classified information. When I was on the Intelligence Committee from 2001 through 2011, the Iranian Hezbollah infiltration into Central and South America was an issue of major concern and major focus. You know, going from what Ambassador Bolton told this committee a year ago about Iranian Hezbollah presence in Venezuela and cooperation with Venezuela, and moving all the way up to the border. It has been something that we in the intelligence community have, it has been documented. It is well understood and is of major, major concern to us. And so it has been an ongoing activity. And what it becomes, especially for Hezbollah, it develops two things. It develops, as was brought up earlier in the hearing today, the narco-trafficking. It becomes a huge source of revenue for Hezbollah. And it is happening. It becomes a potential for smuggling resources from Central and South America into the United States. There's no doubt that Hezbollah is involved in the border. And if you know, El Salvador had an election last week, or excuse me, at the beginning of February. They're going to have a follow-up, a runoff election very, very soon. And it's, you know, the favorite right now is expected to lead Venezuela lead El Salvador into a direction that will have closer ties with Iran. Iran has seen Central and South America as a wonderful and fertile ground, and they love the location. So we've been it's well documented. We've been concerned, and I think, you know, it's been 3 years since I've gotten a classified briefing from the intelligence community. I think it'd be worthwhile for this committee to ask for that briefing.
Thank Dr. Levitt. Can you follow up on that?
Thank you very much. As Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen noted, one of the last times I had the pleasure of testifying before this committee was on the Western Hemisphere report. I'll refer back to that testimony, that discussion, where we noted that despite this intelligence, there was apparently some miscommunication with those drafting the report. This is a very, very important issue. The thing with the tunnels is this. The tunnels we've found are very, very sophisticated. There are some ways they parallel tunnels that have been done by Hezbollah, but I've yet to see any evidence that it's actually Hezbollah doing it. Doesn't say yes, doesn't say no. We have seen movement across the border. The most significant in the case of Hezbollah was Mahmoud Kourani, arguably one of the most dangerous Hezbollah operatives ever to be in the United States, and he's one of only 2 I know of open source cases, despite the vulnerabilities we talk about, but of only 2 known cases where actual terrorists did cross the border. One was the Somali Shabab, the other was Mahmoud Qurani. And that's very, very disconcerting. In terms of the Nisman report, which is very, very important, there are lots of parallels that are happening today to the type of intelligence infrastructure that they created back in the day in the early 90s at the time of the bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in '92 and the Amia Jewish Community Center bombing in '94. Back then, people talked about the key Iranian involved recruiting people to serve as they described them, their words, not mine, his antennas. Taxi drivers, all kinds of people reporting back on all kinds of things going on. And Nisman describes in some very disturbing detail how this is happening even today, and one case where there has connectivity back to the United States.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Excellent question. Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. And pleased to welcome Dr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here. And I listen with, I don't know if it's fear or just great consternation. You were talking about, man, I have so many questions. You were talking about the severe sanctions in Iran. How much more severe can you make them? And before you answer that, I want to add that it seems like they got to a point where they kind of leveled out as far as the effectiveness of that. Am I right in that, or is that a wrong interpretation? Chairman, you want to go with that?
One of the things that's happened with the sanctions is that I think you do reach a point where you level off in terms of exactly the amount of capabilities that you can have, unless you just ratchet it down and you actually close it off.
Well, that's what I was seeing, because as I read through these reports, as severe as the sanctions are that we thought, what I saw was Iran had met a steady state, and they were supplying militants and guns and that, and then they were expanding in South America. And so it didn't seem like it had the effect that we were hoping it would, and I know other nations are complicit in that. What else could be done? And I know we can't do it by ourselves. You've got to have cooperation amongst the international community. You know, in your experience on 9 years on the Intelligence Committee, or 10, what else would you say would have to be done to make those more effective? And is that the way we need to go?
Well, the sanctions become much more effective the larger the group of people who are actually working to implement the sanctions. The thing that I'm looking for, or the thing that now raises concern with me as we move forward, is what's happened in the Ukraine over the past weekend. I think it's going to be much more difficult to get a coalition to expand and strengthen the sanctions if the P5+1 talks fail. That's where we are right now, okay? We've eased sanctions. If the P5+1 talks fail, the question will be, how do we strengthen the sanctions, reimpose them to ratchet down? I think it's going to be much more difficult to do so in the future.
All right. Dr. Levitt, let me ask you something. You were talking about human abuses at home, to promote that more in Iran. How effective is that, and has it been in the past? And is there a lot of media sanctions where that word doesn't get out over there?
We've done very, very few sanctions that are specific to human rights abuses. The human rights abuses have continued and expanded over time, including recently under the presidency of Rouhani. And I think that there's a lot of benefit to be made by showing solidarity with the Iranian people over something that is a universal issue. On the issue of sanctions, I would echo what Chairman Hoekstra said, the need to balance our tools, not only in the unilateral and the multilateral, which is very true, but also in the full toolkit. As I mentioned earlier, sanctions are only one tool, and if we only focus on those, they can only be so effective. When I was in government, I used to sometimes push back on saying, you know, let's sanction this, let's sanction that. Sometimes you'd have difficult problems, no one would have a good solution. Surely Treasury can sanction something. Here's an example where other tools will be very effective too, and as I've testified before this committee in the past, we should be reaching out to our allies in the region. We should be sharing information with the people who even aren't our allies to show the nature of the activities that the Iranians are engaging in the southern half of the Western Hemisphere. And we should be pushing them to do things like we've done, limiting the miles, concentric circles that Iranian diplomats can travel. limiting the number of diplomats who can come into the country, the number of visas that are given. There are ways to constrict their activities beyond just financial sanctions, and I think we have to think more creatively about that.
Okay, and I want to ask all three of you this. This will be a short answer. As Mr. Sherman brought out, you know, Hezbollah and others could be bringing WMDs across our southern borders, any of the borders, I guess, realistically. Would you recommend securing the border is an issue of national security?
Yes. Absolutely, but I think as or as Representative and Ranking Member Mr. Sherman said, will we ever get to a point where you have a totally secure border? I mean, the decision that the members in Congress will have is it's going to be a risk-reward effort. How much money are you willing to spend to secure the border, to what extent? But will you ever get to a fully secure border where they couldn't sneak in a nuclear weapon or WMD or some other materials? I
think more importantly, can you afford not to secure the border? And Mr. Levitt, your answer on that too, secure the border, national security?
There's no such thing as 100%. So I think to say, can we afford not to be secure, it's a false question. I would recommend the committee hearing from people in government who are doing this. We put a lot of time, effort, and money towards this. I think we do a very, very good job. I'm not fully convinced that smuggling a device across the border would be as easy as everybody thinks, but I'm not an expert in it. But I think the committee should hear from people who have career expertise on the issue.
I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for your testimony today. And I'd like to ask all the panelists to address the question of how you believe the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah will change if the Assad regime falls. And are they contemplating that? And is there a long-term strategy for Iran in Syria, or sort of what is driving their decision-making with respect to their participation?
When it comes to that, of what Iran has been looking at as the Plan B, that's something that in many ways is what drove their calculus to really ramp up what they've been doing the last couple of years, is because they realized that Plan Bs do not look very good for Iran in Syria. Without that kind of beachhead that they have in the Levant with Syria, it's extremely difficult for them to be able to execute not only their major elements of their foreign policy, but it really undermines that whole narrative that they are leading this charge against Israel, against the West, and it brings into question the whole survivability of Iran itself if it loses Syria. What we certainly would imagine is they will look to build up second-tier elements in Syria that would look, what I would kind of think, look like Hezbollah, mini Hezbollahs, that would be able to provide some form of influence and activity inside Syria. From Hezbollah's perspective, they're also in an extremely difficult position if they lose Syria. And frankly, what they have done, even though it's been very interesting from an operational standpoint of what they've been able to do inside Syria, this expeditionary effort that they've had, it's also left them in many ways more vulnerable back at home. And they're increasingly in a position where they're having to defend their backyard. There's growing concerns about Sunni extremism in the north and other places inside Lebanon. And so what you're seeing is if you lost Syria, Lebanese Hezbollah would actually be in a very, very dire situation, in my opinion. And it would force them in many ways to find a new path forward inside the state to be able to continue. Because I think they can theoretically survive without Iran as some type of political entity, but it would be very difficult for them.
Iran and Hezbollah are not about to have a breakup, not anytime soon. There is a core, fundamental theological underpinning between them ever since Iran sent 1,500 Quds Force operatives to the Bekaa Valley to help found them in the early 1980s. If anything, the conflict in Syria is driving them closer together, and should they lose in Syria, I think that wouldn't break them up. It would only harden still, because Hezbollah, Iran's strategic partner, would need Iran even more. It's important to note that our understanding now is that when Iran first asked Hezbollah to get involved, they sent someone from the Quds Force. And that Hezbollah actually first said, maybe we shouldn't do that, because they understood that this would be bad for the brand, right? There's no way to say that we're resisting Israel when we're targeting fellow Muslims in Syria. A Lebanese Shia satirist wrote in a Lebanese newspaper, it looks like the boys from Hezbollah have lost their maps, right? They're no longer engaging in resistance. They're no longer doing, as they always say, something that is, whatever we do, it's in Lebanon's interest. It may not be clear at first. Well, this is not. If you're a Lebanese of any confessional faith, your number one concern is renewed civil war, and Hezbollah is not doing anything good there. But then Iran sent a representative, we understand, from the office of the supreme leader. Now we get into the principle of waliyat al-faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent. And at that point, when they say jump, you say how high. And that's exactly what happened. And Hezbollah was told not only to act, but to act decisively. And they've done that. And this solidifies that strategic partnership.
I'd agree with what my colleagues have said here. I think the other question that you get that goes beyond, Syria has clearly created a fault line and has highlighted the divisions between the Shias and the Sunnis. But the real question moving beyond Syria is what is the level of participation and cooperation, and I go into this in my full testimony, that might evolve in the future between organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and al-Qaeda. That is, once we get past Syria and that has played out, is it possible for these organizations to create greater cooperation and move forward? They've done it on isolated events in the past, but can they develop a more unified global strategy?
And may I just ask Dr. Levitt this final question to you? You made reference to two things. One, that there's a lot more that we could be doing to show the deceptive conduct of Iran and sort of diminish their standing to the rest of the global community. Can we start that process this morning and maybe share with us some more examples? And the second, you made reference to highlighting the human rights abuses as a powerful tool. Why is that an effective strategy? What do you think is the best way for us to use the human rights abuses in Iran to advance that objective?
Thank you for the question. Look, this is a universal right. This is something that resonates with Iranians when they see people, being murdered for their faith or what have you. And finding ways to highlight this shows that we're not the other. We're not, the big Satan. We're people like they are, and we stand up for human rights wherever they are. And it, by the way, shouldn't always and only be us. The same way we were talking earlier about how Indonesians or others could be highlighting the activities of Hezbollah in their area. A universal right should be universally supported. But there are sanctions that could be done specifically about human rights violators. We've done that with people who are violating human rights, Iranians violating human rights in Syria, for example. Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, has been designated 3 times. That's great. On a proliferation platform, counterterrorism platform related to the plot here in D.C., and human rights platforms. Great. Let's have some about what's happening in Iran, not only about what Iranians are doing to violate human rights in Syria. On the deceptive conduct, maybe we can follow up after the hearing. I'm not in government anymore, and like Chairman Hoekstra, I haven't received classified briefings in quite some time. But Iran's deceptive conduct continues in all kinds of different ways, and there are things that we need to be doing to try and I'm sure are being done to highlight these. And I think the fact that Treasury has continued to do exactly these types of designations indicates that the administration is willing to pursue these things, even things that might otherwise be seen as really sensitive, especially at a time during the negotiations, in particular the case of al-Qaeda in Iran.
I thank the chairwoman for the courtesy and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Vargas is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, once again. I see that, and I believe that a nuclear Iran is still the most serious threat to our national security, and especially because I think if they had the nuclear weapon, they'd be one of the very, very few nations that would be willing to use it. And I thought that the sanctions were working, and I thought that the sanctions were working because they had real consequences in Iran. We could argue, as was argued a little bit earlier, whether they harm the regime more than the population as a whole or whether the elites get a pass. I personally think that they were working. That's why they wanted to negotiate. I did hear today that maybe there are other things that we can do. We can expose them. We can disrupt them. But, I don't think that those things work so well. I mean, you take a look at Russia. seems like, saying that you're not going to have the next meeting in Sochi. Well, so what? Are they still going to buy our gas in Europe? That's what they care about. And they rolled the tanks. Iran executes 2/3 of all the children executions in the world is in Iran. That's what it's thought to be. And that's, for me, that would seem that would embarrass the hell out of them. It doesn't seem to. So I don't know. I guess I ask you, I sort of throw up my hands and say I think we're being incredibly naive when we think that anything but real pressure will cause them to act differently. Mr. Chairman, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I am skeptical of the soft power efforts. I really would agree that the most effective tool would be strong economic sanctions. That's actually what has an impact and gets people's attention.
Doctor?
Look, as a former Treasury official who was involved in this, I love that everybody thinks that that's working, and that's great. And I would certainly say that agree with you that it was working, that it is working, and that it can continue to work. But I'll say again, sanctions, financial tools alone will never solve your problem. We have to fold in other tools. I think not to do that is naive. To think that if you only expose human rights that will solve your problem, also absolutely naive. But I think one of the reasons that the Iranians you don't really see an impact by the fact that apparently 2/3 of all children killed is because that doesn't get out there. That's not in the Iranian media. They're not, and we're not. Others are not making that public. Let's make that public. Not that that alone will solve the problem, but how do we leverage all elements of national power together to have an impact? And I think that there's no question the sanctions have been the single most effective thing. But there are other things we can be doing, and sanctions alone are not our panacea.
Mr. McInnes?
Yeah, I would just add that one of the things that we should keep in mind is that given how essential both its support for terrorism as well as the nuclear program itself is so essential for Iran's ideology as well as its national security, it's almost impossible to break the bank on them. This is something from a sanctions perspective, what we've seen in Syria, for example, where Iran has offered up, maybe, $13, $14 billion in loans to the Assad regime in a time when it's having significant economic problems. It shows you, for things that really, really matter to Iran, they're going to go, it doesn't matter how much money we take away from them. However, disruption and pressure, making things more frustrating for them, and they do respond to disruption and pressure, and I think they make changes in their calculus of how they are going to operate based on what we are willing to do, what they think we are willing to do to push back. The challenge for us is that, as long as this regime is as it is, it will continue to support terrorism and will continue to pursue a nuclear weapons capability, even if it puts it in kind of a mothball stasis for a while during the negotiations. So that's something that, if we're hoping to really achieve America's interest here, we have to recognize that the best we can do right now is push back, make it frustrating for them, and have them recalculate. And then, as over time, that erodes the credibility of the regime, and hopefully will change the regime internally.
Well, I think that, I guess my faith in the notion that the soft pressure that we're applying is really Western soft pressure that's not really affecting them much. I mean, I think the pressure of the sanctions were really hurting when the economy starts to falter and potentially collapse. That's the type of pressure I think that works. I think that's the type of pressure that's always worked. And so anyway, I appreciate you being here. I hope I'm wrong, but really do appreciate time. Yeah, Doctor, you had to comment?
If I could just add one more thing. Key here is the administration has said that if and when the Joint Plan of Action doesn't produce results, that the sanctions will be revisited. This has been stated many, many times. So this has to be a credible threat. And the question is, what's the timetable, right? So we need a little more clarity on what the timetable is. Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Under what circumstances will it be renewed? Because that obviously gets to the point that you're making of the sanctions and whether the threat of renewing really serious sanctions is near-term or not.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Levitt, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's why my position is it's essential that this Congress presently state very clearly that the sanctions that would follow a unsuccessful completion of the joint plan of action would be a level of sanctions not back to what we had October of 2013, but orders of magnitude greater. And the more clear we can be now, today, I think the better the incentive for Iran to stay at the table and complete those negotiations. But I want to turn to cyber threat, Chairman Hoekstra. And my friend and colleague, Mr. Collins from Georgia, I think was perhaps overly modest. We talked about the Israel Qualitative Military Edge Enhancement Act and its turn to cyber security as a part of that. Because it is important, as you have all mentioned, Iran closing that gap, where a country like Israel can't match a threat of numbers of troops, is that qualitative edge is crucial. And the qualitative edge today is so much more so at the cyber front. What do you see as the critical things, both vis-a-vis the United States protecting its assets from a direct attack or an attack to financial, our grid, whatever that may be, and also working with our allies like Israel to make sure that they're protected against a cyber attack?
I mean, the threat that we have is that we have no unified U.S. strategy to protect cyberspace, and that, so a unified federal strategy or national strategy to protect our banking structure, to protect the markets, to protect our infrastructure. You go right through the list, and I know Congress has been struggling with this for an extended period of time in terms of what's the balance between the role of government incentives, and those types of things to help the private sector. So, when you get the head of U.S. Cyber Command getting up and saying, we're not ready to defend, that's got to be scary to all of us. And Congress needs to work with the administration in developing that strategy to protect us. I think we all know our capabilities offensively are tremendous. All right? Our capabilities through NSA, which have been revealed through Snowden, we've got some great capabilities. So offensively, we're doing just fine. It's on the defensive side that we are just so vulnerable.
Well, I'm pleased to say that the House voted 399-0 for that. I think we do need to come to a unified approach, as you touched on. Let me shift gears a little bit, and I only have a little bit of time. But what I've heard from the panel today, and again, thank you for your comments. This has been very informative. But if I summarize, Iran's driven by goals and strategies, and Iran's goals are survival, regional hegemony, and a spread of its revolutionary ideology. And Iran is willing to use all and every tool at its disposal and is consistently expanding those tools. That's the threat of Iran's nuclear program. That's their terror network. That's their cyber threat. And as was said, I think Dr. Lev, you said it, for them it's an all-at-once strategy, and we need to have an all-at-once response. My question, if you will, is the pressure points. What opportunities do we have to pressure Iran within the context of all at once on their side and all at once on our side that can be most effective now in the context of the JPOA, in the context of what's happening in Ukraine? Where should we be focusing our first attentions? Mr. McGinnis.
I think first and foremost is coming up with a better approach to Syria would be something that could have an immediate effect on Iran's calculus. I think that's something that Iran is right now, as we've discussed, is all in Syria. It is an existential problem for them. They will do whatever it takes to keep Syria going, but at the same time, that also induces potential for significant overstretch on Iran's part, and it's something that we could certainly take advantage of in many, many ways, both exposing their behavior and their activities against fellow Muslims there inside Syria, as well as, frankly, it's eventually going to become a personnel resource drain for them. It's been talked about, can Syria become the next Vietnam for Iran's Vietnam? Maybe, but it is something that Iran is more committed to Syria than any type of expeditionary force that the U.S. has encountered or has engaged in the last several decades. So this is something that I think is a first step.
Dr. Levitt, briefly.
I completely agree. I think that we make the mistake of trying to put Syria in one box and Iran in the other. The most important, critical area where we need to push back on Iran is Syria. There was a Wall Street Journal article not a long time ago that pointed out in the title that the reason for the Assad regime's comeback is because of our mismatched commitments. They are fully committed and all in, and we, and I don't mean only the United States, we, the West, are not, and that will continue to be a problem unless we change it.
Chairman Hoekstra.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me, a very, very difficult question. I would probably tend to disagree with my colleagues on the panel in talking about that the focal point at this time is Syria. The time may have passed in Syria to develop an effective strategy, and it's one thing to say develop an effective strategy without identifying one. I'm at a loss at this point in time to identify an effective strategy with where Syria has evolved to over the last 12 months. We don't have a strong role there, and you've got the opposition now to Assad is primarily dominated by the jihadists and al-Qaeda and those types of groups. So where you go and what our role or what the West's role in Syria might be. My concern is, as Congressman Vargas said, we gave away perhaps our most effective tool with sanctions and the ability to reimpose them as part, I agree, as part of a unified effort, a full-force effort, we've given that tool away.
Great. Well, again, thank you very much. I wish we had more time for a further conversation. The transition from proxy to partnership of this terror network, I would love to have the opportunity to explore that further. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Excellent questions. And now we turn to Mr. Connolly for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome back, Pete, to the Congress. You just said we gave away one of our most effective tools, sanctions. What did you mean?
Well, I believe that with the P5+1 talks, we have relaxed sanctions, all right?
Would you rather have not had the interim agreement? You mean, is it your view that we should have just kept sanctions on and ignored those talks and the Phase 1 negotiations that were completed? Is that better?
As I said earlier in my opening statement, developing foreign policy, I recognize how hard it is. Yes, my preference would have been to maintain the sanctions in place. My experience in dealing with Iran and watching very closely their nuclear program from my perch at the Intelligence Committee has been that, one of the things and one of the tools and the most effective tools that Iran has used in the past is negotiating for more time to forward its goals and objectives. And I believe that that's what we are involved in with the P5+1, that they're negotiating, through negotiating, they're not only getting more time for their nuclear development of their nuclear program, but also for their wide range of other activities.
Gotcha. So you would not have, in fact, you wouldn't have even entered into these negotiations then, given that point of view.
I would have entered. I'd be more than willing to negotiate. Would have been more than willing to negotiate with Iran, but I would have expected more upfront action before there was an easing of sanctions.
Dr. Levitt, do you agree with that point of view?
Thank you for your question. I think the real issue with the sanctions is perception and misperception. I think part of that is, as the chairwoman opened today's hearing with, is that not all the information has been released publicly, and that creates a lack of transparency. A lot of people talk about sanctions being dropped, sanctions being lifted. They've been suspended, and that is an important difference. And the things that have been suspended can be put back in place. It's not even put back in place, resumed very, very quickly. We haven't removed anything. The real issue is that this perception has trickled down now to the private sector. You do have now businesses knocking at the door. And that is important because it creates political pressure. You're going to have, if you haven't already, big business come knocking at your door.
Well, let me, thank you. But Mr. Hoekstra just said, we gave away the most important tool we have, sanctions. Do you agree with that? That we gave it away by agreeing to a Phase 1 interim agreement to basically roll back the nuclear development program in Iran?
I agree that there is a perception out there that we gave it away. I don't think we did, but I think the fact that we're not countering that perception is a problem.
Does Iran have that perception?
That is an excellent question, because when you're trying to deter someone from doing something, the only thing that matters is whether they believe that your threat is credible, and I'm not so sure they do anymore.
Well, what do you think motivated Iran to get to the table in the first place?
I think that it was primarily the sanctions.
Right.
No question.
So you think in this brief period of time, Iran has gone from these are hurting, we've got to do something to reverse this, especially with a new president who's got a mandate, perceived mandate, to the point where, you know what, we can use this. Mr. Hoekstra suggests, and it may be true, that Iran's just buying time here, they're not serious, that none of the things they've agreed to really are material, and they're no longer afraid of the United States or the West in terms of economic sanctions. I find that really hard to believe. I mean, all that matters at the end of the day, I mean, these other things matter, but what does Iran think? And you have to deal with the fact that Iran came to the table. We haven't even talked to Iran since 1979, virtually. And they agreed to certain metrics. Now, we can all debate whether those metrics are substantial enough, or whether at the end of the day they'll really work, or whether they're subterfuge for something else. But the fact of the matter is they agreed to those metrics, and they're under enormous scrutiny internationally on whether they comply with those metrics and what happens to the next stage. And, you know, I mean, the proof of the pudding will be in whether we meet those metrics, it seems to me, not whether some businesses think sanctions have been relaxed to the point where they can now apply to do trade with Iran. What matters is the people at the table, face to face, what do they think? And that's really, to me, the critical question. If they think we're not serious, if they think we're not ready to resort back to the tool Mr. Hoekstra thinks we gave away, well, then we're really in a world of hurt, it seems to me. And I'm not where Mr. Hoekstra is. I'm not at all sure that that's the case. Final question. Mr. McGinnis, you talked about Syria being an existential issue for Iran. Could you just explain that just a little bit? How is it existential?
Yeah, thank you for the question. What I would say is for Syria and Iran's relationship may have started off back in the early 80s as a kind of a marriage of convenience, where they were basically the only ones supporting each other after the 1979 revolution in that area. But over time, it's become so entwined, the relationship between the states, that Iran sees Syria as its strategic depth, in the sense that if it needs to keep the fight, and aside from being able to, of course, promote its ideology and push against Israel in the West there in the Levant, it needs to have a place that its enemies are fighting not at its borders, in a place that, you know, that is a viable retaliatory and deterrent capability. And that's what you typically see is one of the things that we fear that is in the calculus for the U.S. government or the Israeli government if we look at a potential strike on the nuclear weapons program. The fear of the Levant blowing up, the fear of, you know, terrorism exploding in the region comes from that ability to have that base there in Syria. If it doesn't have that base in Syria, it's very difficult for it to do that. And Iran's going to feel itself to be extremely vulnerable. And also, on the soft power side of it, it's the ideology that the Syria is the focal point, it's the crux of that resistance. And if that resistance falls apart, the whole project that Iran's been engaging in since the '79 revolution, it comes into question. And that is something that I think Iran fears what will happen if it loses Syria, to the point where, frankly, we've even had some comments I'm not mistaken, from IRGC leaders, that they would be more, that Iran is more willing to lose the Arab province of Khuzestan there in the southwestern part of Iran, the Arab-speaking part of Iran, would be more willing to lose that than to lose Syria, because they can, just as they did during the Iran-Iraq War, they can regain that province there. But if they lose Syria, they can't regain what they have in the rest of the Middle East.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, and I'd like to, as we wrap up this hearing, remind members if they look at the memo that we have prepared about Iran's support for terrorism worldwide, I'd like to emphasize that Iran, through its proxies, continues to launch attacks against the MEK at Camps Ashraf and Liberty in Iraq, with one attack, the one in Camp Ashraf, in September 2013, leaving 52 dead and 7 missing, and there have been several attacks on Camp Liberty, also with deaths and many hurt. So this is an ongoing problem that is not in the past tense, and we will continue to monitor that situation. Thank you, gentlemen, for excellent testimony. Thank you to all of our members for participating, and with that, the subcommittees have adjourned.